Well, how you doing today? This is Johnny Palmer, pastor of Calvary Baptist Church, the Grace Place, Hiwasse, Arkansas. And we want to continue on our study on the book of Ecclesiastes. I know it's kind of a weird study, It's it's kind of a unique book in the Bible, but it's cool. Judas Bierwurst wrote, and this is from the perspective of 6-year-old, and it's called If I Were in Charge of the World and Other Worries. It says, if I were in charge of the world, I'd cancel oatmeal, Monday mornings, allergy shots. If I were in charge of the world, there would be brighter nightlights, healthier hamsters, and basketball baskets 48 inches lower. If I were in charge of the world, you wouldn't have lonely, you wouldn't have clean, you wouldn't have bedtime, or don't punch your sister. In fact, you wouldn't even have sisters. If I were in charge of the world, the chocolate sundae with whipped cream and nuts would be a vegetable. All 007 movies would be rated G, and the person who sometimes forgets to brush, sometimes forgets to flush, would be allowed to be in charge of the world. Well, if we were in charge of the world, I'm sure things would be a lot different. There wouldn't be no need for a dentist. Their cars would always start. There'd be no financial problems. There'd be no empty pews. Nobody'd ever get sick. The grass wouldn't need to be cut. And I guess the world would be different, but I tell you, it wouldn't be better. Amen. God alone knows what is ultimately for our good and what's not. And so here we are in Ecclesiastes. We have vanity is seen in the fact that we cannot figure out the ways of God. Okay? So we're really in Ecclesiastes, and we're going to, Lord willing, take chapter 3, verse 1, all the way to chapter 4, verse 3. So this might get a little long. Well, first of all, God's sovereign ways in the seasons of life. That's 3:1 through 10. Principles laid out in 3:1 says there is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. God is in control of the universe, and he has appointed a time literally for everything. Daniel 2:20 through 22, Daniel said, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the ephods. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and the hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. God has an eternal plan. The thing of it is, that plan can't be anticipated and really understood as we live our lives in time, okay? And as we look back on his long life, I think his name's Jaber Crow, he's the main character in Wendell Berry's novel. He reflects on how God's intelligence and providence often catches us by surprise. He writes, I can't look back from where I am now and feel that I've been very much in charge of my life. I have made plans enough, but I see now that I have never lived by my plan. Nearly everything that has happened to me has happened by surprise. All the important things have happened by surprise. And whatever has been happening usually has happened before I had time to expect it. He says, and so when I have thought I was in my story or in charge of it, I really have been only on the edge of it, carried along. Is this because we are in an eternal story that is happening only partly in time? So the principle is God is in control, and we can't figure it out, okay? But all we have to do is realize if you're a believer, everything's working for his glory. That's the key. and it'll ultimately be for our good. The purposes, chapter 3, verse 2 and 3. Notice a whole string of things here. First of all, we have a birthday and a death day, okay? He says in 3:2, there's a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. So we're going to have a birthday. We've had a birthday or we wouldn't be here. And bar the rapture, we're going to have a death day. And the truth of it is, we are not in control of either days. Nobody here decided when you be born, and you're not really going to decide when you die, I guarantee you. So notice, even plants have a beginning and they have an end. And this planting and plucking are according to God's sovereign seasons, okay? Notice God's purpose also includes both things that are destructive and constructive. 3:3, there's a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up. You know, God's plan allows for both murder and medicine, hurting and healing. Old buildings are constantly being torn down and new ones are being built. Well, there's a time for gladness and for sadness. Verse 4, there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. On some occasions we cry, and on others we laugh. Life is consisted both of funerals and weddings, okay? Notice time includes removing and receiving. Verse 5, there's a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. So there's a time to remove stones, like when you're clearing out a field. There's a time to gather stones, like when you're about to build something. There's a time to hug, and there's a time when hugs are not appropriate, okay? Notice there's a time to get and a time to give. Verse 6 says there's a time to search and a time to give up as lost. There's a time to keep and a time to throw away. You know, sometimes you get things, at other times it's off to helping hands of the Salvation Army, right? Notice there's a time for mourning and a time for mending. Verse 7 said there's a time to tear apart and there's a time to sew together. There's a time to be silent, a time to speak. Well, in Solomon's day, grief was expressed by tearing one's garment. Just read Genesis 37:29. 2 Samuel 13:21, etc. Of course, after those garments were torn, they needed to be sewed back together. And sometimes silence is golden, and sometimes it's just plain yellow. I mean, you know. Notice there's a time for hostility and a time for harmony. 3:8, he said there's a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. Not only to love, but to hate. That's kind of surprising, isn't it? We should hate that which is evil, for example. Romans 12:9. God's plan not only includes peace, it includes war. Peter Muhlenberg gave perhaps the most dramatic sermon of the Revolutionary era. Peter joined the army and decided that in his last sermon before leaving, he would do something unusual to drive his point home. Well, after reading from Ecclesiastes 3:1, he said this: there's a time to preach and a time to pray, but there is also a time to fight, and that time has come. Peter threw off his robes to reveal the uniform of a militia colonel. He then recruited the men of his congregation, who became known as the German regiment, which Peter commanded throughout the war. He eventually rose to the rank of Major General, and after the war returned to Philadelphia a hero. He spent the remainder of his life in local and national politics. You know, God's purposes cover a wide range of opposites. Life is like a roller coaster, you know, up and down. You never know what's coming at you. One day you have to duck, the next day you got to pucker. There was a tornado that came through Merritt Island. That was down in Florida. A lady who lived in a trailer house had a little parakeet, and she loved that parakeet. And anyway, the house trailer was devastated, but the parakeet was gone. and she missed the parakeet more than she missed the house trailer. Well, many days after the tornado, a person looked up in a tree, and sure as the world, there sat a parakeet. Well, she was able to coax the bird out of the tree and got a hold of it. Well, she began to inquire around if anybody had lost a parakeet. Well, they determined this lady had lost a parakeet, and it seemed so miraculous. I mean, it was in the newspaper. The article said the parakeet has been found after the tornado sitting in a tree. And anyway, they were trying to, find some good about the disaster. But the next day, a cat in the neighborhood ate her parakeet. Who can figure it out? I mean, that's the way life is, okay? Life is, sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. And the truth is, you might just as well accept it. Frank Sinatra used to sing, "That's life." And the truth is the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It is a wise, loving God who has engineered it all, okay? So there's purposes, and we don't obviously usually understand them. Well, notice the problem in 3, 9, and 10. What profit is there to the workers from that which he toils? He says, I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. Well, our problem is we do not want a life filled with ups and downs, okay? We don't want pain and pleasure. We don't want good and evil. We want life to be all up and all pleasure and all good. But it doesn't work that way. Chuck Swindoll noted this: Solomon gave us a long list of opposites. 14 are positive, 14 are negatives. In some way, they seem to cancel each other out so that the net result is 0. Many of these tensions leave us on a dead-end street. What's the profit under the sun when you slice life across the middle and analyze all the strata, when you boil it down to its basics and put yourself into it at 86,400 seconds a day? There's 0 in it for you. Well, kind of interesting. You might have your taxes done, for example, and you're thrilled you're getting back $300 from federal. Then you discover you owe $90 in state tax. And then when you get up to leave, the lady at the counter informs you owe $210 for her filling out your taxes. It makes a fellow want to join in with a fellow who sang "The Thrill Is Gone." Well, life is like that if you leave God out, see, and eternity out of the picture. You're doing good if you end up with a big fat 0. Don Anderson drives home the problem of a person who realizes that he's not in charge of his life. He said this: the reality that his life is beyond his control may hit a man in his midlife hard like a heavyweight boxer's punch to the belly. Not only does life dictate the movement of the years, but our family, our friends, and career may seem to function independently too. His wife may begin to try out her wings, return to school or the workforce. His kids are probably typical teenagers who increasingly flaunt their independence. His boss fires, hires, transfers people, and generally operates without his consent. Frustrated by the out-of-control state of affairs, he may begin to resent God's sovereignty. In fact, one of the main reasons a severe crisis occurs in the life of an individual is because he's attempting to combat something that God has permitted in his life. The fellow in crisis is increasingly dissatisfied with the circumstances in which the Lord has placed him. This unhappiness is really rebellion, resistance to God's will. And the rub is that no matter how we resist, the Lord isn't going to budge. The Lord isn't going to budge till we break. Read Psalms 51:17. He said, Solomon has been looking for answers He has fought. He has indulged. He has worked himself to a point of exhaustion. His marriages are in trouble. His job is a hassle. His kingdom